All right, welcome. Let's dive right back into our analysis of Marx's Capital. In our last discussion, we left things in a really interesting place. We were in the sphere of circulation, the marketplace, where everything seemed fair and square. The capitalist buys labor power, the worker sells it, and they exchange things of equal value. But that leaves us with a huge puzzle, right? If everything is traded at its proper value, how on earth is profit even possible? It seems like it shouldn't exist. Well, that's precisely the paradox that Chapter 7 sets out to solve. To do it, we have to move from the world of buying and selling to the world of production. And Marx signals this shift with this fantastic quote. He tells us we have to leave behind the noisy sphere of the market, this place that seems to be all about freedom, equality, and property, where everyone looks like an equal player. He says we need to follow the capitalist and the worker into the hidden abode of production, because it's here, behind closed doors, that the relationship between them completely changes. And that change, well, that's where we're going to find the secret to profit. So here's our game plan. We're going to follow Marx's logic step by step. First, we'll step across that threshold into the hidden abode. Second, we'll need to understand the labor process in its most general, universal form, what it means to work, period. Third, we'll see how capitalism grabs hold of that universal process and twists it into something else, a process for creating value, what he calls a valorization process. That's going to lead us right to our fourth point, uncovering the secret of surplus value. And finally, we'll see how capitalist production is actually a fusion of these two different processes. Okay, so we're inside the factory dates, and immediately the atmosphere is totally different. That formal equality we saw in the market, it's just vanished. The guy with the money is now clearly the capitalist, striding ahead. And the owner of labor power is now the worker, following behind, a little more timidly. The worker is no longer just selling a commodity. They have become a component in a process that the capitalist now controls. The relationship has shifted from one of equals exchanging goods to one of command and control. And this brings us back to the central problem, the real head-scratcher that classical economists just couldn't solve. If all commodities are exchanged at their value, and remember, the value of labor power is just the time it takes to produce the worker's means of survival, how can a surplus, a profit, ever come out of it? Let's say the capitalist pays 3 shillings for a day's labor, and that represents 6 hours of labor needed to make the food and shelter for the worker. If the worker then works for 6 hours, they've just created enough value to cover their own wage. The capitalist breaks even. There's no profit. So the solution, as Marx is about to show us, isn't in the exchange with labor power, but in its consumption. Now, to really get what's specific about capitalism, Marx does something brilliant from a methodological standpoint. He first takes a step back and looks at what is general to all production in any society. He analyzes the labor process independently of any specific social formation. This is a crucial move. By first defining what it means for humans to work at a fundamental level, he can then pinpoint exactly how capitalism takes that process and reshapes it for its own end. So what is the labor process at its most basic? Marx defines it as a purposeful activity. It's the fundamental way we humans interact with the world around us. We take things from nature and we adapt them to fit our needs. We produce use values, things that are useful to us. This, he says, is a universal, timeless condition of human existence. It doesn't matter what kind of society you live in, this is what humans do. And this universal process can be broken down into 3 simple parts. First, there's the activity itself, the work. Second, you have what you're working on, the subject of work, like cotton or land. And third, you have what you're working with, the instruments of work, your tools, your machines, whatever they might be. It's when you apply that living labor to these means of production that you transform nature and create something useful. Simple enough, right? Okay, now for the pivot. We've got our universal baseline for what work is. Now we're going to see what happens when it becomes capitalist work. Because the capitalist isn't buying labor power and raw materials just to make a nice, useful object for himself. No, the goal is to produce a commodity that has more value than all the inputs combined. Making something useful is just a means to an end, and that end is the expansion of value. Marx calls this the Verwertings process, or the valorization process. You can think of it as 2 processes happening at once. On the one hand, it's still a labor process. You've got someone doing concrete work, making a specific useful thing, like yarn. But on the other hand, it's a process of creating abstract value. And the capitalist's whole goal is to make sure this process runs long enough to create not just value, but surplus value. Let's make this concrete with Marx's own numbers. Okay, let's look at the capitalist's books. He spends 10 shillings on cotton and, let's say, 2 shillings for the wear and tear on his spindle. That's 12 shillings of existing value, what Marx will call constant capital, that is simply passed on or transferred to the final product. No new value is created there. Then he pays 3 shillings for a day's worth of labor power. Now, let's assume that it takes 6 hours of labor to produce the goods a worker needs to live, which is what that 3-shilling wage represents. So during those 6 hours, our spinner works and creates 3 shillings of new value. So what's the total value of our yarn after 6 hours? It's the 12 shillings transferred from the cotton and spindle, plus the 3 shillings of newly created value. That's 15 shillings. And at this point, the capitalist is just looking at his books, and he sees he spent 15 shillings to get a product that's worth 15 shillings. He's just gotten his money back. There's no profit, no surplus value. And as Marx puts it, our capitalist is pretty surprised, because he didn't get into this business just to break even. He wanted to get more value out than he put in. Something's not right. The process isn't over yet. This brings us right back to the heart of the mystery. The capitalist bought the use of the worker's labor power for a full day. But so far, the worker has only worked long enough to reproduce the value of their own wage. The key insight here is that the capitalist didn't buy 6 hours of labor. He bought the worker's ability to labor for an entire day. So what happens in the rest of that working day? And here it is. This is the aha moment. The solution to the paradox of profit is found in the unique quality of this very special commodity, labor power. It has a magical property. Its consumption, the act of working itself, actually creates new value. And, crucially, it can create more value than it costs. This distinction is everything. You absolutely have to grasp this. On the left, you have the value of labor power. That's determined by what it costs to keep the worker showing up every day. Let's say it's 6 hours of labor, which equals that 3-shilling wage. That is what the capitalist pays. But on the right, you have the value that the use of that labor power can create. The capitalist bought the right to use that labor power for the whole day, let's say a 12-hour day. The secret, the profit, is hiding in the gap between those two things. So what this means is that the working day is actually split into 2 parts. The first part is what Marx calls necessary labor time. That's the time the worker spends creating value equivalent to their own wage, the 6 hours in our example. But any work they do after that point, that's surplus labor time. And this surplus labor is quite simply unpaid labor. It's the one and only source of the surplus value that the capitalist gets to keep. So let's go back to our numbers one last time. In that second 6-hour period, the worker keeps working and creates another 3 shillings of brand new value. This extra value costs the capitalist absolutely nothing. So now, the total value produced in the full 12-hour day is 20 for cotton, 4s for the spindle, doubled because the whole process took twice as long, plus the 6s of newly created value. That's a total product value of 30 shillings. The capitalist's total cost was 27 shillings, 24 for the means of production, plus 3 for the wage. And the difference? That 3-shilling gap, that's the surplus value. The mystery is solved. This discovery leads Marx to this incredibly vivid Gothic metaphor. He says capital, the machines, the raw materials, is dead labor. It's the product of labor from the past, frozen into things. By itself, it can't grow or create new value. It can only expand vampire-like by sucking living labor, the actual value-creating activity of the worker. So this whole process of valorization is how dead labor animates itself with living labor, all to produce surplus value, which then becomes more capital, more dead labor, ready to suck more living labor. So now we can bring everything together. The secret to how profit is made is that capitalist production isn't just one simple process. It has to be understood as a unity of 2 very different processes fused together. So as we see here, on the one side, capitalist production is a labor process. It makes useful things like yarn or coats. But at the exact same time, it's a valorization process. It's a process for creating surplus value. But, and this is the crucial part, this isn't a partnership of equals. The first process, making useful stuff, is completely subordinated to the second one, making profit. The use value, the yarn itself, just becomes the physical container, the carrier for the underlying goal, the expansion of value. Okay, so we've cracked the code. We now understand the origin of surplus value. But solving one puzzle just leads to another, doesn't it? The obvious next question is, how do capitalists try to get more of it? The entire history of capitalism, from this perspective, is a struggle over the rate of surplus value. And that struggle plays out in two main ways: trying to make the workday longer, what Marx calls producing absolute surplus value, and trying to make work more productive, to shrink the part of the day the worker works for themselves, what he calls relative surplus value. These dynamics and the crises they inevitably lead to are exactly what we'll be digging into next.